All right, I think we're going to get started here. Thank you for joining us today for a fireside chat, Professors Meghan Sullivan and Paul Blaschko, about the role of work in the good life. I think we're going to have people trickling in as we go, but we're excited and humbled by the amount of interest in today's program. We have many participants joining us today at our virtual fireside. My name is Ryan Cook. I'm a former student and teaching assistant of Meghan and Paul. The last two times we were together, we covered their new book, The Good Life Method. And today we will be diving deeper into a few chapters of the book, which cover themes of work and its place in the good life. At this time, we would like to thank our co-sponsors. Thank you to both the East and Illinois Alumni Club regions, Mendoza College of Business, and Faith ND for working side by side with Think ND and helping share this event. We really appreciate your support. Today, you will have the opportunity to ask questions to Meghan and Paul through the Google form being shared in the chat now. This will allow us to facilitate questions as efficiently as possible. We will try to address as many of them as we can within the given time constraint. And now I would like to welcome Professors Meghan Sullivan and Paul Blaschko to the talk with us today. Meghan and Paul, how is the workday going so far?
Oh, it's great. I got up at 4 a.m. I had to fly to Minnesota. I'm visiting my family this weekend. So I've been up for a while. It feels like noon here. Actually, it is literally noon, but it's going well. Thank you, Ryan.
That's awesome. Yeah, it's got to feel like the end of the workday pretty soon.
Yeah.
Meghan, how's your day going?
This week is always insane. I feel like at this point in the semester, it's the week after spring break for people who are not keeping track at home. And so everybody has this beautiful spring break and then comes back to campus just thinking, let's race 100 miles per hour to the finish line. And so between the coming off of spring break, St. Patrick's Day, having a ton of deadlines, thinking about the end being in sight for the spring semester, it's felt like this week has just gone like that.
Oh yeah, this is the first in-person St. Patrick's Day it's got to be like 4 years now, I think.
I think so. And the weather yesterday was beautiful. So I'm not sure a lot of people were reading Aristotle.
Well, I'm sure they could. Right?
I have a feeling the good life was very, very present on campus yesterday, but I don't know how much of that was mediated by philosophy.
Well, I feel like that'll work its way into our discussion today, because a healthy work-life balance is something we're shooting for here. So working late on St. Patrick's Day is probably not the good life, but what am I to say? So I guess that kind of gets us into what we're talking about today, which is how does work fit into the good life? You guys wrote a book about the good life, and it's got specific chapters, chapter 4 dedicated to work, and it pops up in other places as well. But what's the connection here between work and the good life? How can philosophy help us to do better at work?
Yeah, I think there's a couple of different ways that philosophy can help. So if you think about philosophy, or at least one sort of approach to philosophy, as in a really big picture way, trying to sketch out what is the good life, you just can't do that without thinking about work, right? We spend literally a huge percentage of our waking hours at work, or most of us do, right? And, if you're trying to think of, what is it going to be for me to live a good, meaningful life now in 10 years, over the next 40 years, you've just got to take into account work. There's some simple and maybe too simple ways of thinking about it. You might think, well, the good life is what I do in my time off, and work is what I do in order to have that time off, right? In order to afford the time and the sort of, things that I need to enjoy and live the good life, I've got to work. So you got to work. Work is a necessity. It's labor. It's difficult. It's toil, right? But look, it's instrumentally valuable because look, you can then afford to actually live the good life. And I think, like I said, I think this is sort of a simplistic view. I think on reflection, not many of us would actually endorse that view. In part because work is just such an integral part of what we find meaningful and valuable in life, right? I'll tell just a really brief story to illustrate this. My brother works at a car dealership in the Twin Cities in Minnesota here. Nice. And at the beginning of the pandemic, he was laid off, like a lot of the people, like most of the people at his dealership, he was laid off. But because of the way that the, sort of support packages and everything work in Minnesota, he actually started making quite a bit more money unemployed than he was making when he was employed. And a couple of months in, they called him and they said, hey, we can give you your job back if you want, or you can just stay unemployed and then we'll give you your job back in a couple of months. And he realized, like, if I take the job, I'm going to lose thousands of dollars. And so he called me and he said, Paul, I think I'm going to go back to work, even though I'm going to lose a lot of money doing this. And he just posed this question to me. He goes, do I work for more than just money? And I was like, yes, you do. Of course you do. You know, there's so many things that work provides: community, meaning, structure, activity, just intellectual engagement. And so again, I think if you want to think seriously about what the good life is, you've really got to hone in and think about your relationship to work. Even if that relationship is, I want to minimize work. I don't want to work any more than I absolutely need to. Or if you think, I want to work as much as I can, right? Or maybe as much as I can in this sort of chapter of my life. So that's the really broad sort of way that I would frame the relationship of work to the good life. And yeah, I guess I'll leave it there.
Yeah, no, I'm glad you mentioned kind of that compartmentalization too, because I feel like that's how a lot of people view work. It's just, separate from your life when you punch out. But Meghan, have you kind of found a similar philosophy of work, or what does your current thoughts on work look like?
Yeah, so if folks have tuned in for any of the other episodes, they'll know that Aristotle's kind of our guide through a lot of these philosophical questions. And Aristotle argues in the Nicomachean Ethics and in the Politics that we need to recognize that we are social, rational animals. We're the kinds of creature that only feel like we're flourishing or only flourish when we're aware of how we fit into various groups and when we're aware of the common good that's structuring our lives. And for a lot of modern folks, we don't feel, I love being from South Bend, but I don't feel like a really strong sense of meaning being a South Bender. Or it's not something that I like reflect on quite a bit about what I value about my life. If I got a chance to buy a really huge house with a swimming pool in Mishawaka, I might just do it. Like it wouldn't be a great loss for me. But when you ask me which organization I feel like I am a contributing member of, and its goods are my goods, and its destiny is partly tied up with my destiny, I think about work. I think about working for Notre Dame. I think about the people I see every day in the office, the faculty members and staff and students that I work with. I think about what effect I'm having on their lives, good or bad, based on my decisions. And that when I think about the common good, how it shows up every day in my life, it's usually showing up in my workplace. And so if having a common good is a really key ingredient in flourishing, and work right now for folks like us is one of those really big sources of a common good, probably that and our family life are the two big ones, then philosophy is in the business of helping us tell whether we are in a good work situation or we're not in a good work situation. And also in the business of helping us understand what exactly work is. A lot of people tell us what a workplace ought to look like, but in the last 2 years, I think we've been rethinking whether we even understand the concept of work. And that's definitely the territory for philosophy.
Exactly. And I want to pivot off of that because work has changed so much in the past 2 years. Not as much necessarily now at Notre Dame. I've heard things are kind of getting back closer to normal. But Paul, I want to pose a question to you as my first ever remote boss when we shifted the Mellon grant to work remotely in the summer of 2020. How did the change to remote work, how does that affect the feeling of community and kind of the goodness that we get from work? And what are some strategies that you've used to kind of continue to get the good things out of work when we're largely, mediated through screens?
Yeah, and I think that's a great question. The way that I'll approach it, I guess, is as your former boss, Ryan, because we thought really hard about those exact questions when we were trying to set up the kind of internship program that you were going through, but also answer it as an educator, right? Because I've thought with a lot of different professors about how do you teach online, right? Now, luckily, like this wasn't something that we really had to navigate in sort of reality at Notre Dame that much. We were online for, I think, 2 weeks. But we thought a lot about it. And we were preparing for it. And we were worried about, we were just like, what's our plan A? What's our plan B? Okay, so I'll say a couple of things. One, I certainly have noticed that as we've moved from sort of primarily in-person working, right, where you're in an office with people, you're in a building, you're in a hallway, to more remote, very flexible work where people are doing their thing at very different times. Like, I'll get emails from students who are working in that program that you worked in, Ryan, like 2 a.m. And I'll think like, you're working now? Like, I can't imagine like working then, right? Or sometimes I'll wake up at, 4:30 to go to the gym, and I'll be like, you know what, I'll just send a couple of emails right now before I go. And I'm sure some people are thinking, you're working, that's crazy. Okay, so a couple of things that I've noticed. One is that it's incredibly important to try to, as much as you can, increase and maximize what sociologists and some people who have been studying education call transactional presence. And that is the feeling that you are interacting with a real human. And that sounds maybe simple. And we might assume, well, look, I'm on camera. You can see my face. You can see my, sort of cues, nonverbal cues and all that kind of stuff. But it's sort of easy to forget that to be in a room with someone is just what we would say in philosophy, phenomenologically, experientially different, right? In part because I log into a Zoom meeting and I think like, I gotta mute myself. I'm not gonna mute myself. Maybe I'll talk here. There's a different mode of communicating. There's channels. Sometimes I'll text somebody, it's just, these are all things that we're trying to use to approximate the feeling of just being 3, 4, 5 feet from somebody and suddenly having an idea and thinking, well, wait a second, like, what about that thing, and you kind of go off on a tangent. You're like, okay, let's like reorganize. Let's go back to this thing. It just really fundamentally changes the way that we personally interact with each other. And I think, in sort of, education theory, the idea is you've got to try to approximate that as much as you can. And from experience, I can tell you there's only so much you can do to approximate that. So what I've noticed is that even as some people are finding a lot of benefits to the flexibility of remote work and finding things about it that they love and that they don't want to give up now, right? My sister-in-law just applied for a job, and she was offered to work remotely, in part because that's their recruiting strategy now. People are so used to working online, and they want to go places. They want to travel a bit. They want to work wherever they want to work. So there are a lot of real benefits to that, and that's great. But we've got to find ways of not just approximating that kind of relational community, but actually building it. Now, some of that can still be mediated by tech, right? So we have Slack channels and we have text groups and we have all these kinds of things. But there's something that's just irreplaceable in being with other people, in being in their presence. And so one thing we've really tried to do, in classes with professors that I've worked with who are, doing primarily online stuff, or with the program when we were remote and our students were just all over the United States, is just, we got to find ways of building that in, whether it's having a student as an assignment go take their parents out for coffee and interview them about their work life and say like, I want to sit down and I want to talk this through with you. And here's the set of dialogue questions or whatever it is, so that they're interacting with a human, right? And then they can come back and they can share that. Or whether it's, finding key times, maybe once a week, if everybody's physically roughly in the same location, just to get together for like, barbecue or whatever it is. Because again, that is where so much of that community building, meaning making happens. And for me, and this is sort of maybe beyond philosophy and just like a thing I've noticed, it's also where ideas sort of spontaneously come from. It's also where that creativity comes from. When people don't feel like, okay, there's a timeline, there's literally like some sort of thing in the corner that's telling me I can't do this until that's whatever. But you're just sitting there and the meeting ends and all of a sudden you look at somebody and you're like, wait a second, I thought you said this thing and I read this book. Those are things that, to my mind, we can do a really good job of approximating and trying to capture. But I think we've just got to also realize that some of those things we can't, because as Meghan said, we're social animals, right? We are made to be in relationship and community.
Exactly. And that sounds largely familiar to when we came back in the fall for God and the Good Life, the class that Meghan and Paul teach. Some of those first dialogue meetings that we had with students, and it was, all masked and spread out. And it was an interesting environment, but being back there was so important in the sense that just being in the same room as fellow students again felt really cool. And just, I remember my agenda for the first meeting, I probably shouldn't tell you guys this, but was literally nothing on it. It was just getting us back together, getting people, to feel that sense of community. And I mean, we're, as you said, Paul, we're social animals. It's something that we need to have in our lives. And I think work can be so much a part of people's lives. It echoes the Airbnb example from the book. So I guess getting back to the book, Meghan, there's some really interesting examples that show up here. We've got Airbnb, and then immediately followed by this monastery in Iowa. Can you explain a little bit more on how we get these cases and how you guys were using them in the context of the book?
Sure. So, I'm an avid reader of the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal. And one thing that the teaching team for God in the Good Life is always doing is looking for a real life case study of somebody walking into a philosophical trap or finding themselves in a problem that philosophy might help them with. And I remember in the first weeks of the pandemic reading this New York Times story about Airbnb's top team, their leadership team, who were facing this huge backlash from their employees. Because basically what happened, Airbnb had worked really hard for years to develop this very strong sense of workplace culture. And in particular, they talked a lot with their employees about how they were the Airbnb family. These are a lot of remote workers, so a lot of like software developers who are scattered everywhere, but they would spend a lot of time thinking, as Paul said, like we want to have relationships with each other. We want to understand each other as complete people. Airbnb is going to be here for you, cares about your development and flourishing as a person. And this was a really important, seemingly authentic part of the culture of the institution. Problem: Airbnb exists to run a somewhat unregulated rental market. And Airbnb at the end of the day needs to be responsive to its shareholders. And they hit a huge block that they were not expecting when the pandemic happened, and a lot of people didn't want to rent out their homes to strangers anymore. None of us were traveling, and we were all quarantining. So the business proposition for Airbnb just bottomed out. And Airbnb had to lay off a significant percentage of its workforce. Now, people get laid off in kind of brutal, anonymous bureaucratic organizations, and we maybe expect that. I don't expect a soft touch from my IRS agent when he contacts me about like a financial transaction that I need to engage with him on. I expect it to be cold and impersonal. But Airbnb had said that they were warm and personal and a family and were playing this role in the common good of the lives of their workforce. So there were a lot of people where this was their first job who were experiencing whiplash. They were like, you guys had promised me you'd be here for me, and now on a Zoom call, you've laid me off. What does that mean? And Paul and I think, and we argue this in the book, that following the Airbnb case is interesting because it's not that they were a firm with bad intentions. They had the best intentions. They really wanted their employees to feel seen and understood and supported as people, and they really wanted Airbnb to be a wonderful place to work. The problem is that the culture that they were creating around their firm was in an important way mismatched with what the firm actually did, with like the common good of what the firm actually pursued, which was a rental agency. And so when you have this culture but objective mismatch, means goal mismatch, you're going to find philosophical problems, which is something Aristotle also warns us of. The intentions that you have in going after your goal are super important. And so we try to unpack this case and like what Airbnb might have been able to do differently to anticipate this problem, but also what we should learn reflecting on their case when we try to think about how we're participating in the common good of our work and what work can and can't be for us. And one of the case studies that we also go through are people for whom the means that they pursue their work is really intimately tied to the goal of the work, and it's really, really guiding a lot of their lives, which are people that choose to take holy orders or people who choose to enter monastic communities. And here, the way that you work is tied up with your thoughts about prayer, your thoughts about what the membership in the community means, thoughts about your obligations to one another, and what the group is ultimately going to be willing to sacrifice or not for the common good. And we think that that's, we oftentimes take this really narrow view of work is a kind of publicly traded company that you could draw a paycheck from. But in fact, throughout human history, we've had a much broader expansive idea of what it could be to have a job. And by looking at maybe some of these less talked about ways that people think of themselves as working, we might get some ideas for making our work life a little happier.
Yes, yeah. And that idea of when it's so paired with the objective and you buy into, I mean, holy orders, it doesn't get more serious than that. I contrast that with my first job at a car dealership. I'd throw on my name tag and my cargo shorts, and that was about it. But it seems like some of these companies are asking a level of buy-in that's just unheard of these days, not necessarily under orders, but under contracts, under the guise of we're all family here. Some of that, intentions aside, Paul, how do you feel about commitment to some of these companies? And can you, in good conscience, devote yourself and really drink that Kool-Aid if you don't completely align with the company's objectives?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. And it shows up differently for different people in different circumstances. Right now I'm going to get like Jesuitical and sort of like Aristotelian, make some distinctions. But, you know, on the one hand, think about the person who literally has one job available to them. And it's a job that they don't particularly like. Maybe it doesn't use the skills that they sort of most identify with or love, but it's the job. It's the only one. And maybe, you know, the economy is such like, this is your job and this is, you know, this is what you got to do. Okay, that person, you know, if I was their friend having coffee with them or talking to them, walking, giving them advice, I would say, you know, it's really important to remember that like work doesn't have to be the ultimate source of meaning for your life. Work doesn't have to be a source of meaning for your life. Now, it is for most of us. And I think there are really good reasons why it is for most of us, but it doesn't necessarily have to be, right? I worked as a cashier at Target when I was in high school, and I loved it. And I loved it in the same way that I really loved like playing ultimate Frisbee, you know, sort of in this informal league with some friends. It wasn't something that I went to and I thought like, okay, here's the ritual and here's the meaning and here's the thing. It's that there were all these good things about it. There were people I enjoyed working with. I had friends there. I didn't mind the work. I loved talking to people. And like, as they're checking out, kind of saying like, oh, that's cool. Like, I really like that. Where'd you get it? You know, I like that stuff. But again, I really didn't invest much meaning into that job. And if, you know, I had a supervisor that came in and said like, you've got to find meaning in the target or something like that, I probably would have sort of shrugged it off. I might have shrugged it off. Or maybe I would have, you know, really thought hard about, well, wait a second. Like, is this actually more than just a job? Should I invest some meaning in this? Actually, contrast case, there's a bunch of high school friends that I had at the same time I was working at Target that worked at a local grocery store. And their community was like that. It was like employee owned and it was local. And they had this weird connection. I mean, weird to outsiders, but it was so, you know, in some ways life-giving to them. A lot of them sort of matured and developed. Some of those people got married. It was weird, right? But again, there's very similar kind of a job, but very different approaches when it comes to how much meaning you're even going to look for in that job. So I guess what I'm most interested in my role as an educator, you know, and I think about this a lot in connection with this class that I teach called The Working Life. It's basically the good life method applied to work, right? So we're thinking about work. What I'm most interested in is allowing students to explore and get enough sort of, you know, of a reflective distance on their work, on their activity, and on their lives, so that they can make an informed choice, right? So instead of saying, you know, coming in and having the company say, look, we want you to live here. Isn't that awesome? And here's a gym that you can work out in. And turns out we give you food at 10 p.m. every night, you know? So, you know, if you're at your office 7 a.m. to 10 p.m., like it's just, you know, it's going to be amazing. And kind of getting sucked into that unreflectively, right? Instead of that, I want students to be able to think really sort of critically, right? Like, what do I want out of this? Like, what do I, you know, like how much of myself should I be giving to this job? And is the sort of way in which I'm being engaged or compensated or whatever, is that compatible? Like, are those two things compatible? And again, at the end of the day, it could be, yeah, you could be like, you know what, the next 10 years of my life, I'm going to devote to a monastic-like life, but in Silicon Valley, working in this particular way, because I want to just get as many experiences as I can, because the second half of my life, I want to do this other thing. None of these things sort of determine like, look, this is the attitude you should end up with in work. But I think what philosophy can really help us see is that unreflectively approaching your workplace or your sort of career discernment or whatever it might be, it makes you vulnerable. It makes you, it's a huge risk, right? You could get sucked into this kind of a culture that turns out is really bad for you. And on the flip side, you can discern a fit with an employer or just with a general kind of work or whatever it might be that's deeply fulfilling and that actually really complements all of the other goals in your life, whether that's, raising your kids or having enough money to like start a philanthropic organization, whatever it might be. So at the end of the day, I always just think like more reflective capabilities. It's going to increase your agency. It's going to increase your ability to kind of think hard about these things, which I think are some of the most important questions, at least for our students at this point in their lives.
Exactly. And that stays on our Aristotelian theme of, if that's what you want to do, if you want to work 7 to 10 and your objectives are aligned with what your habits are having on a daily basis, that can work. And I'm really glad that you pointed that out. I'm also glad that you name drop Target. Maybe we get some podcast style ads on our next one. And I would like to give a congratulations for that working class at Notre Dame. I heard it filled up really quickly. So this is something that students want to learn about. This is something that students see as immediately pressing at Notre Dame. My major coming in was not what it left as. So I know it's reflective and it's a process in which we refine this. So it's great to hear that students and hopefully people in the workplace are thinking about what their career goals are and how their day-to-day really aligns with that. And getting back to that level of buy-in, and I mean, if you're going to spend 14 hours working for a place, there's almost this element of commitment and faith kind of comes up in the book in chapter 7. We have this whole topic on faith, and then we break from it to talk back about work again. And I thought that was pretty powerful. And it comes along with these case studies. So Meghan, 2 of my favorite wire fraud cases are the Theranos one, now on Hulu, and the Firefest, which I think was on Netflix. But can you break down how these case studies made it in the book and where questions of faith pop up in work?
Yeah, absolutely. I think one thing that we aim for with the working life class, with God and the Good Life, with a bunch of the ethical courses that we offer in the philosophy department, is trying to help Notre Dame students not only become really thoughtful workers someday, but also down the road to be awesome managers and leaders and to be somebody's great boss and to be somebody that founds a company that people are excited to be associated with rather than somebody's slimy boss. And everybody who gets to the phase of being a manager or a leader in a workplace realizes that they have to take risks and manage risk constantly. And this, we argue in the book and with our students, gets us into questions about faith pretty quickly, because when we take a risk, oftentimes we are making a leap of faith with either our beliefs or with our actions or with our character. Like sometimes we're putting our character on the line. And this comes up obviously in the religious context. Somebody's trying to figure out whether or not they would like to join the Catholic Church or whether or not they would like to become an Orthodox Jew, or whether or not they'd like to leave the religion that they were raised in. They might not know the right answers to the big metaphysical questions, or they might feel pretty uncertain if God exists or if this particular religion has the right view about who humans are. And so they might feel like they're taking risks with their beliefs. They're almost certainly taking risks with their actions, or a leap of faith with their actions. They're either going or not going to a certain thing. They're aligning themselves with other people, and they're taking a risk with their character. People are going to find out that they're associated with this movement or group, and they're going to make some assumptions about what kind of person that they are. And that's part of a leap of faith as well. And one of the things that we pick up on in the book, and we take our cue here from William James, this really awesome American philosopher from the beginning of the last century. James points out that these religious leaps of faith are very similar to leaps of faith we take in business and we take in other parts of our personal life, where we face a choice and we want something really good to happen, but we're not certain. And so we have to put our beliefs and our actions and our character on the line. And that can go wrong. This is another thing that we really want students at Notre Dame to spend some time thinking about. One, so they realize the gravity of what it is to cultivate religious faith, but also so they don't become somebody's jerk boss. And so we look at cases where people leapt and landed on their face, morally or otherwise. And two of those cases are following, which we'd actually followed that from as soon as the Wall Street Journal broke the story about Elizabeth Holmes and Theranos. We started talking about it with our students in class. But let's look at this young person who dropped out of Stanford, started this business, really believed in this blood testing idea, but misrepresented how her confidence about whether or not this worked, and in the process harmed a bunch of people and committed fraud on a scale that's likely to send her to prison. Like, at what point did she do something that was morally wrong? And how do we know which leaps of faith for entrepreneurs are good ones and which ones are really serious moral errors? And how does reflecting on those cases help us realize about what faith is going to mean in other contexts of our life? And so one of the things we also hope to show is, even if you think you can kind of ignore the religious philosophical questions in the background, you are wrestling with the question of faith all the time. And it's really important to being a great leader or manager.
Exactly. It's impossible to do any kind of business without that element of risk, which requires predictions. It requires faith in your outcome and in your leaders. I really do like that statement of not having Notre Dame students becoming someone's jerk boss. So it's good to keep that in mind. And I know, like, a heavy theme of this discussion here is that idea of reflection and keeping your purpose in mind and making sure you're not just doing things because, you know, that's your daily schedule. And Paul, there's some element of this that flashes me back to being at Notre Dame and discerning a major, but is this just for like sophomores at Notre Dame, or are these the type of thoughts that we should be having as on a daily basis as we're settled into a career? I guess, how often should this kind of reflection be done?
Yeah. So should you do philosophy daily? Well, yes, I think so. I do, but I'm lucky. And, you know, I consider myself lucky in this respect that it's also my job, you know, so that's good. Now, you know, one thing that is really important to note is that if you're constantly reflecting, you might find yourself paralyzed, right? You can't always be calling into question your basic assumptions about meaning in the world or meaning in life or whether you're doing the right thing. Sometimes, you know, like Meghan's saying a second ago, you've got to take a leap of faith and commit. And you say, you know what, I've done the reflection. I'm not 100% certain that this job is going to be the job that, you know, allows me to do what I want in my life right now. But I've weighed the risks and I'm making the decision. And maybe you then sort of you know, think, let me revisit this in 6 months. Maybe, you know, I'll sort of journal about it and then kind of look over that and do some real reflection again. Now, I think, in fact, what usually happens is that we are presented with, let's say, opportunities to reflect by crises, right? One of my favorite recent books that was published in philosophy is this book, Midlife, by Kiran Satia. He's a philosopher. And it's about midlife crises, but it's really just about crises, right? Just crises that we all encounter at any point in our lives. We read this in the working life class or a chapter from it. But here's why I think crises are such great opportunities and so revelatory. When you have a crisis, especially say a crisis of meaning, you're at a job and you're working at it, and maybe you really just feel a lot of energy from it and joy, and you kind of like it, but you slowly start to realize, or maybe quickly over a couple of weeks or something, you're burnt out. Like something is not connecting. And I'm not talking here about, you know, just some sort of external factor, or like, you know, sometimes, you know, we just experience these kinds of things. We just have some pathology or whatever that happens upon us. I mean, like, you start looking at your work and you think, I love doing this. I have the skills for it, but I just don't even have the motivation to like type out this email right now. Like deep motivation. Like, what is missing here? In those moments, we become paralyzed. Alistair McIntyre actually refers to these quasi-technically as epistemological crises, right? Crises where how things seem do not match up with how they actually are. And he says in those moments, you realize that your way of interpreting the world, he calls them schema, your schema is inadequate, because what it's telling you to do in the face of all the data that you're getting has led you to a point that is practically unacceptable. You think like, I can't move forward. I can't continue. And in those moments, you almost have no choice but to reflect, right? You find yourself unable to take the next step. Because again, for many of us, if we don't know the overarching goal, Like, why am I going to do some task? That's going to feel like a waste of time or a waste of effort, or maybe I'm going in the wrong direction. And so one thing that I talk about quite a bit with my students is, look, these kind of crises, they're normal, right? They happen to all of us. They happened to many of us during the pandemic. We hear all this talk about the Great Resignation. And I think in part, this is a reflection of the fact that the changes in workplace structure, or where I'm working or when I'm working, or even, basic assumptions that I thought were true, that I need to be commuting 2 hours a day to this physical place, maybe those aren't. Maybe the trade-offs that I thought were settled, the amount of time I'm spending at work versus the amount of time that I get to spend with my family, maybe I can sort of call those into question again and reflect seriously on those. And I think that the best thing that you can have in that moment is a bit of philosophy in your back pocket, even if it's just the knowledge that Kieran Satia wrote a book about it, or that Aristotle literally thinks about this stuff, or that Plato has got a dialogue where he's talking to the sophists about whether it's better, to appear strong or to be strong, to appear virtuous or to be virtuous. And just knowing that those guides are out there is orienting, right? And again, I speak sort of, as I go throughout my life, I'm one of these people that, like, every couple of years, I'm almost done with my PhD, or I'm done, I finish it. And then I look around and I think, like, gosh, what now? Like, I put all of my life, all of my energy towards this. And without some sort of guide, without some sort of friend, without somebody to dialogue about this stuff with, you can just spin your wheels, right? And that's deeply uncomfortable. So in my class, what I do is, I try to introduce my students to these potential dialogue partners, Jean-Paul Sartre or Hannah Arendt or Byung-Chul Han. He's one of my favorite continental philosophers right now that talks about leisure and work, or Joseph Pieper, even Karl Marx. We read a little bit of Karl Marx and we ask about alienation and whether that's related to burnout or not. So that inevitably, when the student comes upon one of these opportunities for reflection, they're going to have some place to go. They're going to think, yeah, okay, I remember this, right? Yeah.
That's a great positive spin on crises being that invitation to reflect. I think that's something that's very helpful to think about, as it seems we hit crisis after crisis in these past couple of years. But and when I think of our dialogue partner and friend here, it's coming back to Aristotle. So Meghan, I saw you did an interview where you kind of provided some Aristotelian advice on burnout. So how might Aristotle motivate me to return to work today after this, my lunch break?
You should go back to work, Ryan. You're the person on this Zoom that has the most resembling a real job. So we're all depending on you for
I don't know about that.
For data about moral problems at work. So one thing, another news story that I reflected on about a year ago, the New York Times also ran this story about this company called Ritualist, which is a consulting firm that works with people in the tech industry and small groups in the tech industry who are experiencing burnout. And here's what Ritualist does. They go into a burned out office. I think that's the first thing to notice, is usually it's not just like one worker on a team that's experiencing burnout. It's something people experience together. And that's maybe why we're seeing the Great Resignation numbers go the way they're going. But they go into a kind of burnt out team and help them devise rituals to start to experience meaning in their workday. And a lot of the rituals are hilariously borrowed from major world traditions of celebrating meaning. So one example is we successfully complete the acquisition of another small tech company. We're going to pause on Friday afternoon and we're going to have an acquisition ceremony, and we might light a candle or ring some bells to celebrate. And that'll help people find a sense, the appearance of meaning in the seeming drudgery of working in this firm. And we talk about this in Aristotle in the book and in class for something's clearly going wrong here. Appropriating Christian and Jewish and Muslim religious traditions to try to make tech acquisition agreements feel better for workers who are not feeling meaning at their work just seems, again, like the wrong means to not fitting the right ends. And one of the key questions, and this gets us back to Aristotle tells us that all of the actions that we perform that are meaningfully understood as actions are done for the sake of some end, because there's some good that we're identifying and the actions are moving us towards that good. And that's the problem with ritualist, is like lighting a candle in a worshipful way doesn't seem to have anything to do with like completing a merger and acquisition. It just like, apples and oranges. The means are totally unsuited to the ends. And so if you're somebody that's dealing with burnout, or you're a manager who's trying to help people who are dealing with burnout, you need to keep this Aristotelian lesson in mind. And I think culturally, we often talk about work in terms of what's in it for me. Even a lot of this conversation on the Zoom has been, how do I tell if I'm getting a lot out of work? How do I tell if work is meaningful for me right now? Another question is like, how do I know if I'm being tricked about the meaning of my work? Like maybe I'm just so suckered into the activities that we do at the office that I think my work is more meaningful than it really is. And the advice that Aristotle would give us is talk about a different question. What common good am I a part of? And that's not necessarily about you. It is, because the common good's going to feed into the meaning in your life, but it's also about other people. And there are a lot of jobs that are quite sacrificial. I think I come from a working class background, and I think about both my parents' jobs. They're asked every day to make pretty significant sacrifices of themselves and their wishes and personalities to serve a group. And one of the reasons why they get a lot of meaning out of their work is because they feel really bonded with their colleagues and coworkers, and they feel bonded with the people that their work serves, but not necessarily because they'd say at the end of the day, filing paperwork in a dental office, like filing insurance claims in a dental office, is something that my mom sees as like a meaningful pursuit of eudaimonia just on her own. And so if we want to address burnout, I think one hypothesis that we get from somebody like Aristotle is realizing that people are losing their grip on the common good. Like they're finding it harder and harder to tell these stories about their work and their workplaces. And you can't throw a Band-Aid on that. You can't just like appropriate some other meaningful activities from a different part of life, like ritualist does, and think that that's going to make people feel that their work is meaningful. Because the point is, as Paul said, it's an epistemological crisis. People want to know what the good is that their work is going after. And this also doesn't mean, getting involved with like propaganda or trying to make your business into something that it's not. This is also where Airbnb got itself in a little bit of a pickle. Is look, at the end of the day, if you're running a rental firm, you need to be convincing people that there's a common good in the truth and the actual thing that your firm is doing and doing together. But it's definitely a mistake to say that you look like a rental firm, but you're in fact promoting world peace. Because then you're going to end up with a lot of employees that really should be working at the UN.
Yeah, no, that makes complete sense. And it shows, especially the ritualist example, how you can kind of use these to either religion or family or stuff like these big, powerful tools kind of as a cash grab. And admittedly, that's a pessimistic perspective. So I guess I'd want to turn it more towards at Notre Dame, you're going to a Catholic school and you understand that. And is there anything distinctive about, even in Mendoza, how we how do we prepare Notre Dame students for kind of a Catholic approach to being a worker? Is there any like uniquely Catholic way of going about this? As Paul, I'll start with you on this one. Catholic perspectives on work.
Yeah, I think Catholicism is extremely lucky here to have a rich tradition, philosophically, historically, in just many different ways to draw on in thinking about how we should be educating our students and how we should be educating them as people, how we should be educating them as workers, how we should be educating them as potential, family members, fathers and mothers and whatever else. And one of the sort of things that we start with when we talk about this in the mission of the university is that we look at them holistically, right? We are persons. We have minds and hearts. I was actually over at the Moreau Seminary. I was invited to have dinner and just chat with the seminarians about work and the good life yesterday. I brought my family. Oh man, it was a disaster. It was like there were, hundreds of seminarians, and then we were like going through this buffet line, and my 1-year-old was just like screaming. And anyway, I think it was like a good sort of discernment period for maybe many of them. I don't know. But at the seminary, right, they've got these quotes from Father Moreau on the walls. He says, we never educate the mind at the expense of the heart, or vice versa. So Catholicism is always trying to take these ideas that seem opposed to each other, or at least in tension with each other, and balance them in some way, right? Now, one of the classic traditions that we can draw on here is just the tradition of the liberal arts education, right? Notre Dame is a liberal arts school. And what that's traditionally meant is that we consider the person holistically. You come to Notre Dame and you are forced to take a philosophy class. You've got to sit through God and the Good Life or another like intro philosophy class. You've got to take a second philosophy class. You've got to come in to my classroom and take philosophy of work or philosophy of mind or philosophy of metaphysics or whatever it might be. You've got to do that. And one way that I sort of try to frame this question for the students, because I think that's, for me, 60 to 70% of the battle is just getting the right frame on the problem, the right sort of philosophical frame is, you know, I ask them like, why are you here? Like, not hostilely. I'm not just like, why are you here? You know, I'm like, why are you here? Why are you sitting in a philosophy class? And there's a lot of answers you can give. Well, it's because philosophy majors earn more than any other major, right? And that's true. But it's not the only reason. That's certainly not why Notre Dame thinks you've all got to take philosophy. It's not the only reason. Well, why else? Well, because without philosophy, you're not going to be able to do this kind of care for the soul that we've been talking about today and over some of the other sessions that we talk about in the book. Okay. Without philosophy, you might end up in a really bad spot where you think, man, the way that I've structured my life has come at the expense of a good that is essential to the good life. And now I've missed it and I can't go back and get that. And now I'm in kind of crisis management mode, right? Yeah. So to think about, even just from that starting point, like, why are you sitting in a philosophy class? You can then start to build out and say, well, what else is a necessary part of this holistic sort of liberal education? Some of it's just training in the mechanical arts, as Aristotle might call them, right? Some of it's literally just technical training. Like, if you're going to go into medical school, like, I want you memorizing body parts for 8 hours per day. Because if you're going to treat me or my kids later in life, you need to know technically exactly what's going on in the human body, right? And that, I don't care if that's instrumentalized. I don't care if you're going into that class and not thinking like, oh, this is going to provide deep meaning for me, right? You're going to think like, this is going to allow me to do the kind of thing that's part of a meaningful life. But yeah, it's just memorize. I just got to memorize it, right? So once you start asking those questions, I think you back up and you start to see sort of a complete picture. And again, I would argue that this is just a complete picture of a liberal arts education. And that just gives you more agency. And it gives you, more sort of depth in your ability to reflect.
Exactly. And you see it all the time in the workplace too. If you can't communicate, if you can't write an email, ethics aside, like the liberal arts background is tremendously helpful. And then you add in that Catholic element. And Meghan, I guess I'd want to pose this one to you. I know you kind of chronicle your conversion to Catholicism in the book later on in your life, or later on in your education, I would say. How does that kind of influence your work on a day-to-day life when you're a grad student thinking about Catholicism and what role it plays?
Yeah, I think one thing Catholicism can add to how we talk about work at universities is we kind of unreflectively in academia and at a lot of really top universities like Notre Dame, Rutgers, where I did my PhD, or Oxford, or Stanford, was out at Stanford last week talking about a lot of these questions. We tell a bunch of young people that they can measure the success of their work by its impact, by like how much they produce that's good in the world. And this is well-meaning advice. Like, we want you to be somebody that helps a lot of other people, that has, that's a leader in the sense that like their leadership is noted for having made a difference in the world. And that's all very well-meaning advice. But I think one thing that Catholic social teaching adds to the tradition is this idea that you are so much more valuable than your impact measured outside of you in your life. So that there are lots of ways to have really valuable, meaningful, dignified lives even if at the end of the day, you're not the president of the corporation, or you can't quantify on some external scorecard how important your work has been. And especially the last couple of years with the young people that I interact with here at Notre Dame, I really want them to get this message of being able to see dignity in work in a much broader lens than oftentimes the way that we communicate with them about what they ought to be aspiring for in work. And I can think of a couple of examples here. One, I have a family member with Down syndrome who's an adult woman with Down syndrome, and she doesn't have a job. She doesn't have a job like a job like I do, but she still has work. Like, she plays a really important role in our family. She has days where she shows up to work, where she's like there, kind of loving other members of the family, and is a really important part of our family community and unit. And other days where she's kind of checked out of work and she's a little bit like, difficult, and she knows it. And she has a job, and there's no way that we should in any way like look down on her for missing out on the thing that we normally think work is, because she has always had work. Likewise, there are some people that, because of where they feel called to be in life, have nothing even resembling work-life balance. I can imagine a full-time parent of a newborn, or an Army Ranger, or somebody who's chosen to take on a religious vocation. They just don't like clock in and clock out the same way that those of us who have jobs that are mediated by the economy have work. But they still have work, and they have ways of doing it well and ways of doing it not so well, and there's a dignity in it. And I think one of the areas where a Catholic university like Notre Dame can really serve our economy and the young people that we send out into it is by equipping them to realize that work is like way more expansive than the way maybe a lot of other universities talk about it, and that they have a lot more options for understanding how it's going to fit into a dignified, flourishing life than just imagining that they need to maximize the impact of the particular lane that they end up in.
Definitely. I'm glad that you kind of cover how Notre Dame can provide graduates who are different in those areas, because we talk about burnout on this, we talk about how much should we be reflecting, and I hope it happens at other universities, but it's great to hear kind of Notre Dame's commitment to that. And I understand that we're coming up on 1:00. Due to technical difficulties, we're going to keep pushing through to 1:15, I believe. Feel free to stay with us for this next 15 minutes, or the audio will be posted later as well. But I think this would actually be a good time. Done a lot of talking, but let's turn it over to some of our chat questions that we've had coming in. There's a link in that chat to a Google form, which is the best place to put the chat questions, so we will see them. I guess let's start with one coming to us from Indianapolis. We've been talking a lot about kind of this messy middle, and where we find these crises and transition phases. How do we proactively use these philosophical tools to get through, God forbid you got laid off yesterday? Like, how do you deal with that next day? How does philosophy help us cope?
So one of the things that I'll mention is in this class that I teach, but also the bigger program that it's a part of, and maybe if it's okay with you, Ryan, I'll slip a bit of that in there. I'll plug the program. So we're launching a program right now in the College of Arts and Letters. It's called the Sheedy Family Program in Economy, Enterprise, and Society. And it's for students who want to think really seriously about business and the liberal arts, right? And they want to think about business through the lens of the liberal arts. So in the way that we were talking a second ago about what a liberal arts education is, this program is designed to help them build community and build networks with faculty members who really care about this, with each other, right? People who are sort of like-minded in this way, so that they can go out and produce incredible scholarship on questions that are relevant to business and ethics and anthropology, or so that they can go out and join a consulting firm or start working at a corporation and bring to bear the kind of distinctive critical thinking, broad-mindedness that I think is so distinctive about our Notre Dame graduates. So one thing that I have students do in classes that are a part of that program and in the program itself is to write up their own philosophy of work, right? So after we've considered, like, what does Jean-Paul Sartre or what does like Albert Camus think you should do when you have these existential crises, right? Sometimes the answer for some of these existentialists is things like, recognize the absurdity of sorry, I'm like almost doing a French accent because I can just imagine them like in a Parisian cafe and say like, yes, it is absurd, and it's like, that's the best you can do. That's the best you can do.
Yeah.
And there's an authenticity to that. Okay, so that's what they think you should do. Aristotle thinks, look, one thing you've got to do is you've got to make sure there's enough leisure in your life, and that there's enough contemplation. And he's got really, really particular, very interesting ways of thinking about leisure and contemplation. Because that's what Aristotle thinks you should do. But what do you think you should do, right? Like, what is your philosophy of work? And I think having that, and literally it's a document. This is something that my students write up, 8 to 10 pages. Having that as a document, having that as a living document, the sort of thing that they can go back to and use to direct and guide their lives is helpful. That is the sort of preparation work, right? In the same way that, like, if I'm going to take a vacation and I'm going to bring my family, I do a bunch of research about like hotels right around the Wisconsin Dells area, because like we could push through all the way to Minnesota, but like, come on, like probably there's going to be a point at which we think, gosh, do we have to stop or don't we have to stop, right? I've done the research, I've done the work, I've got that in mind. Maybe I print out a bunch of stuff. That's the sort of role that I want that document to play. The second thing that I have them do is I have them write out what I call a plan of work, like really concretely. In the next week, how are you going to enact or embody your philosophy of work? Maybe it's just taking somebody out to dialogue with them about their experience. My dad just retired like 3 weeks ago or like a month ago. I don't know. I don't remember. He doesn't even know at this point. He's just like, I don't know. I've always been retired. And on the ride home from the airport today, I just asked him questions. What's it like to think as a retired person? And his answer was like, it's totally different. My relationship to time is something I've never experienced before in my life. Okay, that's one way that you can enact it. What about 2 months from now? Are you going to try to get an internship? And why? Just because you need an internship, or because all your friends did, or because you really want to explore what it's like to try to realize this value and purpose in this particular workplace or in this particular kind of job? How about 2 years from now? How about 10 years from now? And again, this is a revisable document. It's a plan, and nothing ever goes according to plan, but you always need one, right? You've got to have the plan so that when you veer off track, you've got something to orient yourself. I think that's just one of the most concrete, one of the most practical things, and all the sort of activity that goes into putting you in a position to do that, that we can do for our students.
Well, it's incredibly pragmatic. The realizing that you're going to encounter hardships, researching those hotels and taking those actions. I mean, it would be great if everything went according to plan all the time, but everyone has a plan until they get punched in the mouth, right? Or whatever the quote is. And so it's important to make those contingency plans. And I think one of the best takeaways I got from Mendoza was the SMART goals, the specific, measurable, achievable. There's an R and then a T. But I think because when you write something out, there's a commitment involved in that. And it's making sure that you're actually going to take those steps that you've been reflecting on. A little bit of God in the good life, reflection versus action, tension there. But I guess we've got so many questions popping up here. So I want to move it along to another one. This one came in for Meghan. So we've been talking about how we're social animals and that can be satisfied at work. And Paul, you were saying that it's better in person. It seems like a lot of people use social media, Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, all of those for social interaction. Do you think that, sorry, this is for Meghan. Do you think that these social outlets show that we can adjust to this remote work and kind of get that social aspect of it? Or is this a different type of social interaction?
That's a great question. I mean, I wear a couple different work hats at Notre Dame. So I teach in the philosophy department, and that has its own set of goals and its own common goods. I run a research institute, and that has its goals and common goods. And then I also work with helping with a bunch of administrative projects around campus, which has its own set of goals. And one thing I've realized is that those 3 different areas of my life all are working better or worse with remote work. So, and Paul kind of mentioned this, but for students who are here living in South Bend, and we are building a residential quasi-utopian community together with them on the basis of liberal arts education and football. In person, man, you can't, like, I can't be a great philosophy professor to those students online. We tried we just left it all on the field. We tried so hard during the pandemic, but it doesn't hold a candle to being together. And in fact, the experience of the last 2 years, I think, has made all of us so appreciative and so hungry for the time that we get to spend together. And there are also certain dimensions of campus life that I don't see ever happening effectively in remote work. Here's one example that really hit home for me a year ago. We had two women in God in the Good Life who died in a car accident, very tragically. And we had to mourn as a community the loss of these two young women who are our friends and our students and the future of our campus. And I remember that was peak pandemic. You know, we had this huge puzzle of, like, how do we mourn as a community when being together is really dangerous? And we had to navigate it because you really just can't go through that kind of showing up for each other on Zoom. I mean, you can have some conversations on Zoom, but there are certain things that just can't work in that format because embodiment is so important. Other extreme, like in a working group that's planning a conference for this summer, and there are a bunch of faculty scattered all around the world. There's a professor in Australia, there's a professor in the Ukraine, and we are all communicating on Zoom really effectively, trying to think about how we understand how each other's universities work and where we might have an opportunity to do something cool together. And I'm so glad for Zoom. I never thought I'd say this, but, you know, especially thinking about our colleague in the Ukraine, we have the capacity to talk to this professor regularly, even in the midst of a war, in like a catastrophic situation where, you know, he's not able to be with us, he's not able to travel, but we are able to be present to him, and he's able to feel like he's part of an academic community and experience solidarity with us because we have this technology. Whereas, you know, you could imagine how isolated and awful it would feel like to experience your work in a really tragic situation like that if you didn't have social media. So there are different extremes, and it all comes back to this, like, what is it that you think that you're doing? And is it the kind of activity where, like, bodily presence is going to be crucial? Or is it the kind of activity where just paying attention intellectually, cognitively, or otherwise is going to be enough? And I think social media has maybe opened up new ways for us to show up for each other. But then we've also realized pretty quickly experiments with it that are never going to give us what we want.
Oh yeah. And it's like what our former coach Brian Kelly would say, it's about alignment, right? What are your goals?
Exactly.
What is the medium that's going to most effectively communicate those goals? And so I think we'll do one final question here from South Bend. Paul, I'll direct this one to you. Earlier we were talking about, you know, the good work environment at Target and at grocery stores, even to the point that, you know, employees are marrying each other, going off. But how can someone find meaning and purpose in a hostile work environment? Hopefully not too many of us have experienced it, but I'm sure it's there. It's largely prevalent issue. But if you're stressed out or in a hostile work environment, how can you find meaning in your work?
Yeah. So here's where I go when I think about that question. I'm obsessed with the television show Survivor. Sorry, just in case we need more people to try to support the show. I'm obsessed with this show, right? In the show, a bunch of strangers who don't know each other all go out to an island, and only one of them can survive. And so they're competing in challenges on two separate teams. And if the team loses, that team has to go back and decide who to vote out at the next tribal council, right? And so you've got this bizarre combination of competing goals and reasons for acting, right? On the one hand, I want Ryan to trust me, because if Ryan doesn't trust me, then we're not going to be able to win the challenge. We're not going to become stronger as a team. We're going to do worse overall, and that means I'm going to do worse overall. But if we lose, you know, I still want Ryan to trust me, but I've got to do something that is just going to betray that trust, literally betray it, right? Now on the show, you might think, well, it's a show, it's a game, everybody knows how it works. And so you're just not gonna, sort of feel the same sort of resentment or anger that you would feel if your friend betrayed you. Not so. This is part of the drama of the show, right? You've got these straight to camera testimonials, confessionals, where people are saying like, I can't believe that my friends, and they're talking about people they know for 3 days, my friends turned on me. They lied to me, right? And you're thinking, well, yeah, but that's literally the game you were playing, right? Okay, now bring this into the work environment. A lot of times at work, there are competing reasons for acting. Sometimes I've got a reason to act in a particular way, and the best possible thing for me to do is at odds with what's the best possible thing for you to do, Ryan. We both want the same promotion. And I can approach that in different ways. I can approach that respectfully and come up to you and say, look, man, I know we want the same promotion. I think I'm the best candidate. You think you're the best candidate? Let's just see what happens. I could sabotage you. I could go, Ryan, nobody likes you here. You would be terrible. Yeah, okay, I could do any number of these things, right? These dynamics, they play out all the time. And in the workplace, you've got your work reasons, and then you've got your kind of personal reasons. And so there's a whole nother layer, a whole nother dimension to it. So once again here, I think, assuming that we're not in the extreme kind of case where it's like a traumatic sort of hostility at work, where I think the best possible thing that you can do in that case is to get out of that situation, right? You can't keep working there. You can network, find ways of exiting. But where it's an environment where you are stressed out and you feel like these relationships are in tension, there's something incompatible here. Even here, I think philosophy can help us. Think about the kind of dialogue that you had, Ryan, when you were a dialogue fellow in God and the Good Life. You had 12 to 15 students come into the same room with wildly different goals, with wildly different reasons for being there. I'm sure that somebody walked in day one and thought, I don't want to be in this class. I want an A, but I don't want to work to get an A. I just want the grade. Somebody came in and thought, like, this is the best class of my life. I've been studying philosophy since high school. And like, this is what people are coming in with, these radically different views. What's good for them? What's good for the group? Some of these are deeply incompatible. And yet you can find a way through this kind of dialogue, through asking the right questions, through, seeking wisdom and advice from Aristotle, from Socrates, from Plato, from whoever, right? Who's writing about this, who's got wisdom to share on it. You can find a way of navigating that. And again, if you can't, that's, maybe that's the bad case, right? Where, okay, you can't do it. You've got to find the exit ramp. But I think we often don't give ourselves enough credit and give the community around us enough credit to solve these kinds of problems. I see it, in the work that I do at Notre Dame administratively. I see personality clashes that I think that is never going to work. And those people sit right next to each other. And over a couple of months, I hear one of them kind of going some distance and asking a question, and the other one kind of, and then suddenly, like in 3 months, they're like hanging out outside of work. And I'm thinking, like, what happened there? And that doesn't just, it happens by accident. It doesn't just happen by accident, though. There are ways of building that kind of dialogue, building the skills necessary for that kind of dialogue. And a lot of it, not all of it, but a lot of it is something that we can learn from philosophy.
Exactly, because we're all united in that search for the truth. And I would add, sometimes they even write books together, those people. But I guess that's what we'll use to plug the Good Life method. If you haven't done so yet, please pick up your copy. Oh, I left mine on my bookshelf, but I know Meghan has hers. Any physical or online book retailer, please leave a good review on Goodreads if you can. If you really like the book, please check out the audio of our last two discussions in which we more deeply explored its themes. Additionally, Meghan and Paul have two Think ND series on what makes a life good and what to believe in uncertain times. These video series, along with those audio recordings, can be found at think.nd.edu. If you enjoyed our program today, please note that we have many similar live events on Think ND. Please check them out and register to participate. These talks are always free and open to the public, so please do share with your family and friends. I want to thank Meghan and Paul again for our discussion today. That's all we have. Aristotle says all philosophy is preparation for death. So
that's Plato. Plato. Yeah.
My note is not translated to philosophy. Plato.
I'm sure Aristotle said it once when he was having like a really bad day.
I mean, Aristotle, Socrates, Plato, they're all the same guy. And I TA'd for your intro class. It's been a minute, but yes, Plato would say that. I think it's time for me to return from my lunch break. So thank you again, everyone, for your participation. Thank you, Meghan and Paul, for your time. Please have a great rest of your Lenten Friday.
Thanks, Ryan.
Thank you guys.